But now that Risha had the upper hand, the peasant had to pay to the last penny. On the estate there lived for many years a ritual slaughterer named Reb Dan, an old man who acted as beadle in the study house, and who, together with Reb Falik, studied a chapter of the Mishnah every morning. When Reb Dan died, Risha began to look about for a new slaughterer. Reb Falik ate a piece of chicken every evening for supper. Risha herself liked meat. Laskef was too far to visit every time she wanted an animal killed. Moreover, in both fall and spring, the Laskef road was flooded. Asking around, Risha heard that among the Jews in the nearby village of Krovitsa, there was a ritual slaughterer named Reuben, whose wife had died giving birth to their first child, and who, in addition to being a butcher, owned a small tavern where the peasants drank in the evenings. One morning, Risha ordered one of the peasants to harness the Britska in order to take her to Krovitsa to talk to Reuben. She wanted him to come to the estate from time to time to do their slaughtering. She took along several chickens and a gander in a sack so tight it was a wonder the fowl did not choke. When she reached the village, they pointed out Reuben's hut near the smithy. The Britska stopped, and Risha, followed by the driver carrying the bag of poultry, opened the front door and went in. Reuben was not there, but looking out a window into the courtyard behind, she saw him standing by a flat ditch. A barefooted woman handed him a chicken, which he slaughtered. Unaware he was being watched from his own house, Reuben was being playful with the woman. Jokingly, he swung the slaughtered chicken as if about to toss it into her face. When she handed him the penny fee, he clapped her wrist and held it. Meanwhile, the chicken, its throat slit, fell to the ground, where it fluttered about, flapping its wings in its attempt to fly, and spattering Reuben's boots with blood. Finally, the little rooster gave a last start and then lay still, one glassy eye and its slit neck facing up to God's heaven. The creature seemed to say, "See, Father in heaven, what they have done to me, and still they make merry." Chapter 2. Reuben, like most butchers, was fat, with a big stomach and a red neck. His throat was short and fleshy. On his cheeks grew bunches of pitch-black hair. His dark eyes held the cold look of those born under the sign of Mars. When he caught sight of Risha, mistress of the large neighboring estate, he became confused, and his face turned even redder than it was. Hurriedly, the woman with him picked up the slaughtered bird and scurried away. Risha went into the courtyard, directing the peasant to set the sack with the fowl near Reuben's feet. She could see that he did not stand on his dignity, and she spoke to him lightly, half-jokingly, and he answered her in kind. When she asked if he would slaughter the birds in the sack for her, he answered, "What else should I do? Revive dead ones?" And when she remarked how important it was to her husband that his food be strictly kosher, he said, "Tell him he shouldn't worry, my knife is as smooth as a fiddle." And to show her, he drew the bluish edge of the blade across the nail of his index finger. The peasant untied the sack and handed Reuben a yellow chicken. He promptly turned back its head, pulled a tuft of down from the center of its throat, and slit it. Soon he was ready for the white gander. "He's a tough one," said Risha. "All the geese were afraid of him." "He won't be tough much longer," Reuben answered. "Don't you have any pity?" Risha teased. She had never seen a slaughterer who was so deft. His hands were thick, with short fingers matted with dense black hair. "With pity one doesn't become a slaughterer," answered Reuben. A moment later he added, "When you scale a fish on the Sabbath, do you think the fish enjoys it?" Holding the fowl, Reuben looked at Risha intently, his gaze traveling up and down her, and finally coming to rest on her bosom. Still staring at her, he slaughtered the gander. Its white feathers grew red with blood. It shook its neck menacingly, and suddenly went up in the air and flew a few yards. Risha bit her lip. "They say slaughterers are destined to be born murderers and become slaughterers instead," Risha said. "If you're so soft-hearted, why did you bring me the birds?" Reuben asked. "Why? One has to eat meat. If someone has to eat meat, someone has to do the slaughtering." Risha told the peasant to take away the fowl. When she paid Reuben, he took her hand and held it for a moment in his. His hand was warm, and her body shivered pleasurably. When she asked him if he would be willing to come to the estate to slaughter, he said yes, if in addition to paying him, she would send a cart for him. "I won't have any herd of cattle for you," Risha joked. "Why not?" Reuben countered. "I have slaughtered cattle before. In Lublin I slaughtered more in one day than I do here in a month," he boasted. Since Risha did not seem to be in any hurry, Reuben asked her to sit down on a box, and he himself sat on a log. He told her of his studies in Lublin, and explained how he had happened to come to this God-forsaken village where his wife, peace be with her, had died in childbirth due to the lack of an experienced midwife. "Why haven't you remarried?" Risha questioned. "There's no shortage of women, widows, divorcees, or young girls." Reuben told her the matchmakers were trying to find him a wife, but the destined one had not yet appeared. "How will you know the one who is destined for you?" Risha asked. "My stomach will know. She will grab me right here." And Reuben snapped his fingers and pointed at his navel. Risha would have stayed longer, except that a girl came in with a duck. Reuben arose. Risha returned to the britska. On the way back, Risha thought about the slaughterer Reuben, his levity and his jocular talk. Though she came to the conclusion that he was thick-skinned and his future wife would not lick honey all her life, still she could not get him out of her mind. That night, retiring to her canopied bed across the room from her husband's, she tossed and turned sleeplessly. When she finally dozed off, her dreams both frightened and excited her. She got up in the morning full of desire, wanting to see Reuben as quickly as possible, wondering how she might arrange it, and worried that he might find some woman and leave the village. 3 days later, Risha went to Krovitsa again, even though the larder was still full. This time she caught the birds herself, bound their legs, and shoved them into the sack. On the estate was a black rooster with a voice clear as a bell, a bird famous for its size, its red comb, and its crowing. There was also a hen that laid an egg every day and always at the same spot. Risha now caught both of these creatures, murmuring, "Come, children, you will soon taste Reuben's knife." And as she said these words, a tremor ran down her spine. She did not order a peasant to drive the britska, but, harnessing the horse herself, went off alone. She found Reuben standing at the threshold of his house as if he were waiting impatiently for her, as in fact he was. When a male and a female lust after each other, their thoughts meet, and each can foresee what the other will do. Reuben ushered Risha in with all the formality due a guest. He brought her a pitcher of water, offered her liqueur and a slice of honey cake. He did not go into the courtyard, but untrussed the fowl indoors. When he took out the black rooster, he exclaimed, "What a fine cavalier!" "Don't worry, you will soon take care of him," said Risha. "No one can escape my knife," Reuben assured her. He slaughtered the rooster on the spot. The bird did not exhale its spirit immediately, but finally, like an eagle caught by a bullet, it slumped to the floor. Then Reuben set the knife down on the whetstone, turned, and came over to Risha. His face was pale with passion, and the fire in his dark eyes frightened her. She felt as if he were about to slaughter her. He put his arms around her without a word and pressed her against his body. "What are you doing? Have you lost your mind?" she asked. "I like you," Reuben said hoarsely. "Let me go. Somebody might come in," she warned. "Nobody will come," Reuben assured her. He put up the chain on the door and pulled Risha into a windowless alcove. Risha wrangled, pretending to defend herself, and exclaimed, "Woe is me, I'm a married woman, and you, a pious man, a scholar, will roast in Gehenna for this." But Reuben paid no attention. He forced Risha down on his bench bed, and she, thrice married, had never before felt desire as great as on that day. Though she called him murderer, robber, highwayman, and reproached him for bringing shame to an honest woman, yet at the same time she kissed him, fondled him, and responded to his masculine whims. In their amorous play, she asked him to slaughter her. Taking her head, he bent it back and fiddled with his finger across her throat. When Risha finally arose, she said to Reuben, "You certainly murdered me that time." "And you me," he answered. Chapter 3. Because Risha wanted Reuben all to herself and was afraid he might leave Krovitsa or marry some younger woman, she determined to find a way to have him live on the estate. She could not simply hire him to replace Reb Dan, for Reb Dan had been a relative whom Reb Falek would have had to provide for in any case. To keep a man just to slaughter a few chickens every week did not make sense, and to propose it would arouse her husband's suspicions. After puzzling for a while, Risha found a solution. She began to complain to her husband about how little profit the crops were bringing, how meager the harvests were. If things went on this way, in a few years they would be ruined. Reb Falek tried to comfort his wife, saying that God had not forsaken him hitherto, and that one must have faith, to which Risha retorted that faith could not be eaten. She proposed that they stock the pastures with cattle and open a butcher shop in Laskiv. That way, there would be a double profit, both from the dairy and from the meat sold at retail. Reb Falek opposed the plan as impractical and beneath his dignity. He argued that the butchers in Laskiv would raise a commotion, and that the community would never agree to him, Reb Falek, becoming a butcher. But Risha insisted. She went to Laskiv, called a meeting of the community elders, and told them that she intended to open a butcher shop. Her meat would be sold at 2 cents a pound less than the meat in the other shops. The town was in an uproar. The rabbi warned her that he would prohibit the meat from the estate. The butchers threatened to stab anyone who interfered with their livelihood. But Risha was not daunted. In the first place, she had influence with the government. For the starosta of the neighborhood had received many fine gifts from her, often visited her estate, and went hunting in her woods. Moreover, she soon found allies among the Laskiv poor, who could not afford to buy much meat at the usual high prices. Many took her side, coachmen, shoemakers, tailors, furriers, potters, and they announced that if the butchers did her any violence, they would retaliate by burning the butcher shops. Risha invited a mob of them to the estate, gave them bottles of homemade beer from her brewery, and got them to promise her their support. Soon afterwards, she rented a store in Laskiv and employed Wolf Bonder, a fearless man known as a horse thief and brawler. Every other day, Wolf Bonder drove to the estate with his horse and buggy to cart meat to the city. Risha hired Reuben to do the slaughtering. For many months, the new business lost money, the rabbi having proscribed Risha's meat. Reb Falek was ashamed to look the townspeople in the face, but Risha had the means and strength to wait for victory. Since her meat was cheap, the number of her customers increased steadily, and soon, because of competition, several butchers were forced to close their shops, and of the 2 Laskiv slaughterers, one lost his job. Risha was cursed by many. The new business proved the cover Risha needed to conceal the sins she was committing on Reb Falek's estate. From the beginning, it was her custom to be present when Reuben slaughtered. Often she helped him bind an ox or a cow, and her thirst to watch the cutting of throats and the shedding of blood soon became so mixed with carnal desire that she hardly knew where one began and the other ended. As soon as the business became profitable, Risha built a slaughtering shed and gave Reuben an apartment in the main house. She bought him fine clothes, and he ate his meals at Reb Falek's table. Reuben grew sleeker and fatter. During the day he seldom slaughtered, but wandered about in a silken robe, soft slippers on his feet, a skull cap on his head, watching the peasants working in the fields, the shepherds caring for the cattle. He enjoyed all the pleasures of the outdoors, and in the afternoons often went swimming in the river. The aging Reb Falek retired early. Late in the evening, Reuben, accompanied by Risha, went to the shed where she stood next to him as he slaughtered, and while the animal was throwing itself about in the anguish of its death throes, she would discuss with him their next act of lust. Sometimes she gave herself to him immediately after the slaughtering. By then all the peasants were in their huts asleep except for one old man, half deaf and nearly blind, who aided them at the shed. Sometimes Reuben lay with her on a pile of straw in the shed, sometimes on the grass just outside, and the thought of the dead and dying creatures near them whetted their enjoyment. Reb Falek disliked Reuben. The new business was repulsive to him, but he seldom said a word in opposition. He accepted the annoyance with humility, thinking that he would soon be dead anyway, and what was the point of starting a quarrel? Occasionally it occurred to him that his wife was overly familiar with Reuben, but he pushed the suspicion out of his mind, since he was by nature honest and righteous, a man who gave everyone the benefit of the doubt. One transgression begets another. One day Satan, the father of all lust and cunning, tempted Risha to take a hand in the slaughtering. Reuben was alarmed when she first suggested this. True, he was an adulterer, but nevertheless he was also a believer, as many sinners are. He argued that for their sins they would be whipped, but why should they lead other people into iniquity? causing them to eat non-kosher carcasses. No, God forbid he and Risha should do anything like that. To become a slaughterer, it was necessary to study the Shulchan Aruch and the commentaries. A slaughterer was responsible for any blemish on the knife, no matter how small, and for any sin one of his customers incurred by eating impure meat. But Risha was adamant. What difference did it make, she asked? They would both toss on the bed of needles anyhow. If one committed sins, one should get as much enjoyment as possible out of them. Risha kept after Reuben constantly, alternating threats and bribes. She promised him new excitements, presents, money. She swore that if he would let her slaughter, immediately upon Reb Falek's death, she would marry him and sign over all her property so that he could redeem some part of his iniquity through acts of charity. Finally, Reuben gave in. Risha took such pleasure in killing that before long she was doing all the slaughtering herself, with Reuben acting merely as her assistant. She began to cheat, to sell tallow for kosher fat, and she stopped extracting the forbidden sinews in the thighs of the cows. She began a price war with the other Laskef butchers until those who remained became her hired employees. She got the contract to supply meat to the Polish army barracks, and since the officers took bribes and the soldiers received only the worst meat, she earned vast sums. Risha became so rich that even she did not know how large her fortune was. Her malice grew. Once she slaughtered a horse and sold it as kosher beef. She killed some pigs, too, scalding them in boiling water like the pork butchers. She managed never to be caught. She got so much satisfaction from deceiving the community that this soon became as powerful a passion with her as lechery and cruelty. Like all those who devote themselves entirely to the pleasures of the flesh, Risha and Reuben grew prematurely old. Their bodies became so swollen they could barely meet. Their hearts floated in fat. Reuben took to drink. He lay all day long on his bed, and when he woke, drank liquor from a carafe with a straw. Risha brought him refreshments, and they passed their time in idle talk, chattering as do those who have sold their souls for the vanities of this world. They quarreled and kissed, teased and mocked, bemoaned the fact that time was passing and the grave coming nearer. Reb Falek was now sick most of the time, but though it often seemed his end was near, somehow his soul did not forsake his body. Risha toyed with ideas of death and even thought of poisoning Reb Falek. Another time she said to Reuben, "Do you know already I am satiated with life? If you want, slaughter me and marry a young woman." After saying this, she transferred the straw from Reuben's lips to hers and sucked until the carafe was empty. Chapter 4. There is a proverb, "Heaven and earth have sworn together that no secret can remain undivulged." The sins of Reuben and Risha could not stay hidden forever. People began to murmur that the two lived too well together. They remarked how old and feeble Reb Falek had become, how much oftener he stayed in bed than on his feet, and they concluded that Reuben and Risha were having an affair. The butchers Risha had forced to close their businesses had been spreading all kinds of calumny about her ever since. Some of the more scholarly housewives found sinews in Risha's meat which, according to the law, should have been removed. The Gentile butcher, to whom Risha had been accustomed to sell the forbidden flanken, complained that she had not sold him anything for months. With this evidence, the former butchers went in a body to the rabbi and community leaders and demanded an investigation of Risha's meat. But the council of elders was hesitant to start a quarrel with her. The rabbi quoted the Talmud to the effect that one who suspects the righteous deserves to be lashed, and added that as long as there were no witnesses to any of Risha's transgression, it was wrong to shame her, for the one who shames his fellow man loses his portion in the world to come. The butchers, thus rebuffed by the rabbi, decided to hire a spy, and they chose a tough youth named Yentl. This young man, a ruffian, set out from Laskef one night after dark, stole into the estate, managing to avoid the fierce dogs Risha kept, and took up his position behind the slaughtering shed. Putting his eye to a large crack, he saw Reuben and Risha inside, and watched with astonishment as the old servant led in the hobbled animals, and Risha, using a rope, threw them one by one to the ground. When the old man left, Yentl was amazed in the torchlight to see Risha catch up a long knife and begin to cut the throats of the cattle one after the other. The steaming blood gurgled and flowed. While the beasts were bleeding, Risha threw off all her clothes and stretched out naked on a pile of straw. Reuben came to her, and they were so fat their bodies could barely join. They puffed and panted. Their wheezing, mixed with the death rattles of the animals, made an unearthly noise. Contorted shadows fell on the walls. The shed was saturated with the heat of blood. Yentl was a hoodlum, but even he was terrified because only devils could behave like this. Afraid that fiends would seize him, he fled. At dawn, Yentl knocked on the rabbi's shutter. Stammering, he blurted out what he had witnessed. The rabbi roused the beadle and sent him with his wooden hammer to knock at the windows of the elders and summon them at once. At first, no one believed Yentl could be telling the truth. They suspected he had been hired by the butchers to bear false witness, and they threatened him with beating and excommunication. Yentl, to prove that he was not lying, ran to the Ark of the Holy Scroll, which stood in the judgment chamber, opened the door, and before those present could stop him, swore by the scroll that his words were true. His story threw the town into a turmoil. Women ran out into the streets, striking their heads with their fists, crying and wailing. According to the evidence, the townspeople had been eating non-kosher meat for years. The wealthy housewives carried their pottery into the marketplace and broke it into shards. Some of the sick and several pregnant women fainted. Many of the pious tore their lapels, strewed their heads with ashes, and sat down to mourn. A crowd formed and ran to the butcher shops to punish the men who sold Risha's meat. Refusing to listen to what the butchers said in their own defense, they beat up several of them, threw whatever carcasses were on hand outdoors, and overturned the butcher blocks. Soon voices arose, suggesting that they go to Reb Falek's estate, and the mob began to arm itself with bludgeons, rope, and knives. The rabbi, fearing bloodshed, came out into the street to stop them, warning that punishment must wait until the sin had been proved intentional and a verdict had been passed. But the mob wouldn't listen. The rabbi decided to go with them, hoping to calm them down on the way. The elders followed. Women trailed after them, pinching their cheeks and weeping as if at a funeral. Schoolboys dashed alongside. Wolf Bonder, to whom Risha had given gifts and whom she had always paid well to cart the meat from the estate to Laskev, remained loyal to her. Seeing how ugly the temper of the crowd was becoming, he went to his stable, saddled a fast horse, and galloped out toward the estate to warn Risha. As it happened, Reuben and Risha had stayed overnight in the shed and were still there. Hearing hoofbeats, they got up and came out and watched with surprise as Wolf Bonder rode up. He explained what had happened and warned them of the mob on its way. He advised them to flee unless they could prove their innocence. Otherwise, the angry men would surely tear them to pieces. He himself was afraid to stay any longer, lest before he could get back, the mob turn against him. Mounting his horse, he rode away at a gallop. Reuben and Risha stood frozen with shock. Reuben's face turned a fiery red, then a deadly white. His hands trembled, and he had to clutch at the door behind him to remain on his feet. Risha smiled anxiously, and her face turned yellow, as if she had jaundice, but it was Risha who moved first. Approaching her lover, she stared into his eyes. "So, my love," she said, "the end of a thief is the gallows. Let's run away." Reuben was shaking so violently that he could hardly get the words out. But Risha answered that it was not possible. The estate had only 6 horses, and all of them had been taken early that morning by peasants going to the forest for wood. A yoke of oxen would move so slowly that the rabble could overtake them. Besides, she, Risha, had no intention of abandoning her property and wandering like a beggar. Reuben implored her to flee with him, since life is more precious than all possessions, but Risha remained stubborn. She would not go. Finally, they went into the main house, where Risha rolled some linen up into a bundle for Reuben, gave him a roast chicken, a loaf of bread, and a pouch with some money. Standing outdoors, she watched as he set out, swaying and wobbling across the wooden bridge that led into the pine woods. Once in the forest, he would strike the path to the Lublin road. Several times Reuben turned about face, muttered, and waved his hand as if calling her, but Risha stood impassively. She had already learned he was a coward. He was only a hero against a weak chicken and a tethered ox. Chapter 5. As soon as Reuben was out of sight, Risha moved towards the fields to call in the peasants. She told them to pick up axes, scythes, shovels, explained to them that a mob was on its way from Laskiv, and promised each man a gulden and a pitcher of beer if he would help defend her. Risha herself seized a long knife in one hand and brandished a meat cleaver in the other. Soon the noise of the crowd could be heard in the distance, and before long the mob was visible. Surrounded by her peasant guard, Risha mounted a hill at the entrance to the estate. When those who were coming saw peasants with axes and scythes, they slowed down. A few even tried to retreat. Risha's fierce dogs ran among them, snarling, barking, growling. The rabbi, seeing that the situation could lead only to bloodshed, demanded of his flock that they return home. But the tougher of the men refused to obey him. Risha called out, taunting them, "Come on, let's see what you can do. I'll cut your heads off with this knife, the same knife I used on the horses and pigs I made you eat." When a man shouted that no one in Laskiv would buy her meat anymore, and that she would be excommunicated, Risha shouted back, "I don't need your money. I don't need your God either. I'll convert immediately." And she began to scream in Polish, calling the Jews cursed Christ-killers, and crossing herself as if she were already a Gentile. Turning to one of the peasants beside her, she said, "What are you waiting for, Matsiek? Run and summon the priest. I don't want to belong to this filthy sect anymore." The peasant went, and the mob became silent. Everyone knew that converts soon became enemies of Israel, and invented all kinds of accusations against their former brethren. They turned away and went home. The Jews were afraid to instigate the anger of the Christians. Meanwhile, Reb Falek sat in his study house and recited the Mishnah. Deaf and half-blind, he saw nothing and heard nothing. Suddenly Risha entered, knife in hand, screaming, "Go to your Jews! What do I need a synagogue here for?" When Reb Falek saw her with her head uncovered, a knife in her hand, her face contorted by abuse, he was seized by such anguish that he lost his tongue. In his prayer shawl and phylacteries he rose to ask her what had happened, but his feet gave way, and he collapsed to the floor, dead. Risha ordered his body placed in an ox cart and sent his corpse to the Jews in Laskiv without even linen for a shroud. During the time the Laskiv Burial Society cleansed and laid out Reb Falek's body, and while the burial was taking place and the rabbi speaking the eulogy, Risha prepared for her conversion. She sent men out to look for Reuben, for she wanted to persuade him to follow her example, but her lover had vanished. Risha was now free to do as she pleased. After her conversion, she reopened her shops and sold non-kosher meats to the Gentiles of Laskiv and to the peasants who came in on market days. She no longer had to hide anything. She could slaughter openly and in whatever manner she pleased, pigs, oxen, calves, sheep. She hired a Gentile slaughterer to replace Reuben, and went hunting with him in the forest and shot deer, hares, rabbits. But she no longer took the same pleasure in torturing creatures. Slaughtering no longer incited her lust, and she got little satisfaction from lying with the pig butcher. Fishing in the river, sometimes when a fish dangled on her hook or danced in her net, a moment of joy came to her heart embedded in fat, and she would mutter, "Well, fish, you are worse off than I am." The truth was that she yearned for Reuben. She missed their lascivious talk, his scholarship, his dread of reincarnation, his terror of Gehenna. Now that Reb Falek was in his grave, she had no one to betray, to pity, to mock. She had bought a pew in the Christian church immediately upon conversion, and for some months went every Sunday to listen to the priest's sermon. Going and coming, she had her driver take her past the synagogue. Teasing the Jews gave her some satisfaction for a while, but soon this too palled. With time, Risha became so lazy that she no longer went to the slaughtering shed. She left everything in the hands of the pork butcher, and did not even care that he was stealing from her. Immediately upon getting up in the morning, she poured herself a glass of liqueur and crept on her heavy feet from room to room, talking to herself. She would stop at a mirror and mutter, "Woe, woe, Risha, what has happened to you? If your saintly mother should rise from her grave and see you, she would lie down again." Some mornings she tried to improve her appearance, but her clothes would not hang straight, her hair could not be untangled. Frequently she sang for hours in Yiddish and in Polish. Her voice was harsh and cracked, and she invented the songs as she went along, repeating meaningless phrases, uttering sounds that resembled the cackling of fowl, the grunting of pigs, the death rattles of oxen. Falling onto her bed, she hiccuped, belched, laughed, cried. At night in her dreams, phantoms tormented her. Bulls gored her with their horns. Pigs shoved their snouts into her face and bit her. Roosters cut her flesh to ribbons with their spurs. Reb Falak appeared, dressed in his shroud, covered with wounds, waving a bunch of palm leaves, screaming, "I cannot rest in my grave, you have defiled my house." Then Risha, or Maria Pavlovska, as she was now called, would start up in bed, her limbs numb, her body covered with a cold sweat. Reb Falak's ghost would vanish, but she could still hear the rustle of the palm leaves, the echo of his outcry. Simultaneously, she would cross herself and repeat a Hebrew incantation learned in childhood from her mother. She would force her bare feet down to the floor, and would begin to stumble through the dark from one room to another. She had thrown out all Reb Falak's books, had burned his holy scroll. The study house was now a shed for drying hides, but in the dining room there still remained the table on which Reb Falak had eaten his Sabbath meals, and from the ceiling hung the candelabra where his Sabbath candles had once burned. Sometimes Risha remembered her first two husbands, whom she had tortured with her wrath, her greed, her curses, and her shrewish tongue. She was far from repenting, but something inside her was mourning and filling her with bitterness. Opening a window, she would look out into the midnight sky full of stars and cry out, "God, come and punish me. Come, Satan, come, Asmodeus. Show your might. Carry me to the burning desert behind the dark mountains." Chapter 6. One winter, Laskev was terrified by a carnivorous animal lurking about at night and attacking people. Some who had seen the creature said it was a bear, others a wolf, others a demon. One woman going outdoors to urinate had her neck bitten. A yeshiva boy was chased through the streets. An elderly night watchman had his face clawed. The women and children of Laskev were afraid to leave their houses after nightfall. Everywhere shutters were bolted tight. Many strange things were recounted about the beast. Someone had heard it rave with a human voice. Another had seen it rise on its hind legs and run. It had overturned a barrel of cabbage in a courtyard, had opened chicken coops, thrown out the dough set to rise in the wooden trough in the bakery, and it had defiled the butcher blocks in the kosher shops with excrement. One dark night, the butchers of Laskev gathered with axes and knives, determined either to kill or capture the monster. Splitting up into small groups, they waited, their eyes growing accustomed to the darkness. In the middle of the night, there was a scream, and running toward it, they caught sight of the animal making for the outskirts of town. A man shouted that he had been bitten in the shoulder. Frightened, some of the men dropped back, but others continued to give chase. One of the hunters saw it and threw his axe. Apparently the animal was hit, for with a ghastly scream it wobbled and fell. A horrible howling filled the air. Then the beast began to curse in Polish and Yiddish, and to wail in a high-pitched voice like a woman in labor. Convinced that they had wounded a she-devil, the men ran home. All that night the animal groaned and babbled. It even dragged itself to a house and knocked at the shutters. Then it became silent, and the dogs began to bark. When day dawned, the bolder people came out of their houses. They discovered to their amazement that the animal was Risha. She lay dead, dressed in a skunk fur coat wet with blood. One felt boot was missing. The hatchet had buried itself in her back. The dogs had already partaken of her entrails. Nearby was the knife she had used to stab one of her pursuers. It was now clear that Risha had become a werewolf. Since the Jews refused to bury her in their cemetery, and the Christians were unwilling to give her a plot in theirs, she was taken to the hill on the estate where she had fought off the mob, and a ditch was dug for her there. Her wealth was confiscated by the city. Some years later, a wandering stranger lodged in the poorhouse of Laskev became sick. Before his death, he summoned the rabbi and the 7 elders of the town, and divulged to them that he was Reuben the slaughterer, with whom Risha had sinned. For years he had wandered from town to town, eating no meat, fasting Mondays and Thursdays, wearing a shirt of sackcloth, and repenting his abominations. He had come to Laskev to die, because it was here his parents were buried. The rabbi recited the confession with him, and Reuben revealed many details of the past which the townspeople had not known. Risha's grave on the hill soon became covered with refuse. Yet long afterwards it remained customary for the Laskav schoolboys on the 33rd day of Omer, when they went out carrying bows and arrows and a provision of hard-boiled eggs, to stop there. They danced on the hill and sang, "Risha slaughtered black horses, now she's fallen to evil forces. A pig for an ox sold Risha the witch, now she's roasting in sulphur and pitch." Before the children left, they spat on the grave and recited, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live thou shalt not suffer a witch to live thou shalt not." Translated by the author and Elizabeth Pollitt. The Fast. Icha Nochum was always a small eater, but after Roisa Genendel had left him, and his father, may he live long, had ordered him to send her a writ of divorce, Icha Nochum had given himself over to fasting. It was easy to fast in the house of the Besheva Rebbe. The Rebbetzin, his wife, was dead, and Pesha, who kept house, never paid attention to whether one ate or didn't. The servant, El Kadobe, often forgot to bring Icha Nochum his meals. Under his window there was a pit where refuse was dumped. Icha Nochum threw the food out of the window. Dogs, cats, and birds ate the scraps. It was only now, at the age of 40, that Icha Nochum understood why the sages of old had fasted from Sabbath to Sabbath. An empty stomach, a pure bowel, is an exquisite pleasure. The body is light, as though freed of gravity. The mind is clear. At first there is a slight gnawing at the stomach, and the mouth waters, but after the first 2 days all hunger ceases. Icha Nochum had long felt a repugnance to eating meat or anything that came from living creatures. Ever since he had seen Leitzer the Shoiket slaughter an ox at the slaughterhouse, meat made him nauseous. Even milk drawn from udders and eggs laid by hens were repellent. All of these had to do with blood, veins, gut. True, the holy books permitted the eating of meat, but only to saints, who have the power to deliver the sinful souls incarnated in kine and fowl. Icha Nochum would have none of it. Even bread, potatoes, and greens were too much. It was enough to eat just to sustain life, and for that a bite or two sufficed for several days. Anything more was self-indulgence. Why yield to gluttony? Since Roisa Genendel, daughter of the Biala Rebbe, had left Icha Nochum, he had discovered that a man can curb every desire. There is something in the heart that lusts, but one can thumb his nose at it. It wants to think carnal thoughts, but one compels it to pore over the holy book. It tempts one into longings and imaginings, but just to thwart it, one recites the Psalms. In the morning it wants to sleep till 9, but one awakens it at daybreak. What this enemy within hates most of all is a cold ritual bath. But there is a little spot in the brain that has the final word, and when it commands the feet to go, they go, be the water cold as ice. In time, opposing this lusting creature becomes a habit. One bends it, gags it, or else one lets it babble on without answering. As it is written, "Answer not a fool according to his folly." Icha Nochum paced his room back and forth, small, lean, with a wispy straw-colored beard, a face white as chalk, with a reddish pointed nose and watery blue eyes under shaggy yellow eyebrows. Over his forehead sat a crumpled skull-cap with bits of straw and feathers clinging to it. Since Icha Nochum had lost weight, everything hung loosely on his body. His trousers held up by a sash, his gabardine down to his ankles, his creased unbuttoned shirt. Even his slippers and white socks were now too big. He did not walk, but shuffled. When the tempter became too strong, Icha Nochum fooled him with a pinch of snuff or a pipe. Tobacco dulls the appetite. Icha Nochum grappled with the enemy without respite. One moment he was seized with lust for Roisa Genendel, the next with anger at his father, may he live long, for urging him to divorce her. Now he wanted to sleep under a quilt, and now he was consumed with thirst for a cup of coffee. When he tired of pacing, he lay down on a bench, with his handkerchief under his head in place of a pillow. The boards pressed against his ribs made it impossible to remain long in one position. If Icha Nochum managed to doze off, he was immediately attacked by dreams, not one after another, as in the past, but in a swarm, like locusts, as though the visions and delusions had hovered over him, just waiting till he closed his eyes. Roisa Genendel appeared to him as naked as Mother Eve, spoke perverse words, laughed shamelessly. Ichenochem ate pastries, marzipans, drank wine, swooped through the air like a bat. Musicians played, drums pounded. It was both Purim and Shimchas Torah. How can this be? Ichenochem wondered. The Messiah must have come, Shopzitzveh himself. He woke with a start, drenched with perspiration. For a while he still remembered all the apparitions, absurdities, and delusions, but soon they vanished from his mind, leaving only the image of Rosa Genendel. Her body dazzled. He heard the echo of her laughter. I shouldn't have divorced her, Ichenochem muttered to himself. I should have left her and disappeared, so that she wouldn't know where my bones were resting. Too late now. People were saying in Bechef that she was about to become the daughter-in-law of a Galician, the wife of a Karmarner Rebbe. A Hasid who knew the Karmarner Rebbe said that he was tall up to the ceiling, black as a gypsy, and 3 times a widower. Ichenochem caught himself in a sin. Why did he want to leave her a deserted wife? Out of revenge. He had mentally broken the Mosaic precept, "Thou shalt not avenge nor bear any grudge." Ichenochem took the beginning of wisdom from the bookshelf. What were the penances for vengefulness? He turned the yellowed pages, scanning them. There was a long list of sins, but revenge was not among them. Ichenochem grimaced. This was not the first time that he had cursed Rosa Genendel in his mind, wishing her ill. He had imagined her sick, dying, dead. He knew that he was consumed with rancor, hatred, evil thoughts. The stiff-necked body refused to yield. It was full of spite. Ichenochem opened a drawer where he had put a handful of pebbles collected in the courtyard, some nettles he had gathered by the fence, and burrs, such as the urchins throw on Tisha B'Av. Ichenochem latched the door, removed his slippers, and put in the pebbles. Let them cut his soles. He held the nettles against his arms and neck and rubbed his chest with them. They stung, but not too badly. The blisters would come later. "And now I'll treat you to a cold immersion," he said to himself. "Come along." He unlocked the door and started down the stairs. Ichenochem was no longer one man, but 2. One meted out punishment, and the other resisted. One Ichenochem dragged the other to the ritual bath, and the other babbled obscenities, cursed, blasphemed. Ichenochem raised his hand and gave himself a slap on the face. Wanton. Chapter 2. It was the 5th day of Ichenocchem's fast. He had begun the fast on Sabbath evening, and now it was Thursday night. At first Ichenochem had wanted to prove to himself that what the men of old could do could also be done today. If Rabbi Tzadok of Jerusalem had been able to nourish himself for 40 years by sucking at a fig, he, Ichenochem, could surely abstain from glutting for a week.